you find is when organizations get bigger, what they tend to do is increase the organizational structural depth and span. So you end up with many layers between the people who are actually, if you're in a software organization or otherwise, whoever's creating that product, they're the people that are actually making you money. Because if they weren't creating the thing they're creating in the way they're creating it, then you wouldn't have anything to sell. So these people are kind of the most important people. And what I find is a slip, really. It's a flaw in our language and the way we talk about these things. But then we start talking about the top and the bottom. And we relegate the people who are effectively the very core of our organization, who are fundamental to our success, and we put them at the bottom. And we put the people who arguably do the least kind of real actual value creation, we put them at the top. And it sends the wrong message. And then what we do is then we put layers and layers in between those people. So that the people at the top who want to know just what's going on at the bottom, they have to go through 3, 4, 5 different layers of reporting. Maybe that reporting is only produced on a weekly or a fortnightly basis. These people then end up spending their lives filling in report after report, trying to articulate the truth. And all they ever do is just we're trying to re-articulate a proxy. And then, this may sound familiar to some, you do your best to present the truth, and nobody wants to hear it. So I see that someone's commented Chinese whispers by the time it's stopped. Absolutely, because all of our biases, our mental models have been applied to that information as it goes up. Every person that goes up the chain, they're probably wanting to protect their own backside somewhat. So they're going to massage it, or they're just going to reject it and push it back and say, that's not for us. And I think it's hugely important. I mean, I think one of the most interesting conversations I had, it was a couple of years ago now, with someone as a startup, a CEO, who contacted me and said, look, everyone's telling me that I should, implying that I should get more structure and I need to get project managers and I need to increase the number of roles to control all of this. He said, I just don't think it's the right thing to do. I think we've just really misunderstood something in the last 6 months and I need to figure out what that is. And then when I went in and we explained, a single product backlog, let's simplify the structure. If you have a simple backlog and you're focusing on technical excellence, you can begin to change not only the direction of your product, but also the shape of your organization in response to the needs of your product. And that's very, very powerful. So what they did was they restructured. Well, they did a better light restructure, and they sorted themselves out and didn't need the extra elements to the organization that people were suggesting. And I think that all too often, there's a great quote that says, more deliveries go awry because management might take decisions based upon an incorrect understanding of the system than for all other causes combined. And I think it's very, very true. I think when you are at the top, getting a good understanding of the system you are responsible for is of the utmost importance. But we often just think that if we send these top leaders on a CAL, a Certified Agile Leadership course for a couple of days, and then they come back and they're done.
They know, right, don't they, Ben? That's enough, isn't it?
Oh, if only it was. I mean, you look at the number of people that pay for the cow, you'd think that by now the world would be a very different place, but sadly it isn't. It isn't that simple. So one of the big anti-patterns is thinking you need more structure. A big anti-pattern is thinking that education solves the problem. A big anti-pattern is thinking that if you get enough layers and enough proxies, you can actually understand what's happening. And I think Les does a fantastic job at really challenging organizations to question why they're doing things. And that's really uncomfortable. But as I know that you, within Conveyor, you had some great elements of the Spotify model. And there was a coach from Spotify that was quoted as saying, the true Spotify model is finding your problems and then facing up to them and doing something about them, which I thought was beautiful, because that's what this is all about. And Les is a great way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who's not aware, Conveyor has gone down this more of a Spotify version of, because I think everyone's got their own sort of variant of it that sort of grows arms and legs over time, and that's one of the reasons why we're looking to make some changes in that space. And I think you call out some really interesting ones there. Particularly, I think will resonate with everybody. This idea that the further you are away from the coalface, the less of it you actually see the problems that are going on. Particularly a challenge for leadership teams, one that I recognise as well. I'm pretty sure I've been guilty of that more and more, in the past as well. I'll put my hands up to it. A really interesting one.
Well, Nick, you should become a Scrum Master.
They wouldn't have me anymore, Ben. They wouldn't have me. No.
That's why I did at Deutsche Bank. I was a director at Deutsche Bank, and after a while, I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm out of touch." So I just became a Scrum Master again. I was the most highly ranked Scrum Master in all of Deutsche Bank, I think. But I had a fantastic time.
Yeah, I think we could. There's a whole other topic here around, leadership in this kind of environment that's probably warrants another talk for another day. But you made a really great segue there into what I'd like to move on to next, which is for those people who are less familiar with less as a framework. Can you give us a kind of brief overview of less and some of the key concepts that are involved with it, so we get a view here about some of the ways we've been challenging our thinking at Conveyor.
Sure thing, sure thing. So first and foremost, less in its very essence is Scrum. There is very, very little difference structurally, right? So if you think of Scrum as being a product backlog, a series of events, and a team who are then working from that backlog, less does its utmost to stick to just that. So less doesn't mandate managers. It says if you've got them, keep them, use them. They're going to be very useful. But it doesn't say like you absolutely have to have them. And if you look at a pure kind of less organization, then it just consists of less roles. It just consists of product owner. If it's less huge, then you might have area product owners, scrum masters, and teams. And that's kind of it. And so then what you have to do is when an organization decides to use less is then challenge yourself and say, well, why can't we work like this? What needs to change for us in order for us to move towards it? So less is very, very simple. And one of the biggest benefits is this idea of a single product backlog. So that if you're a senior person in an organization, you can walk in and look at a backlog and know exactly what people are working on. If as a product owner, you want to then change direction, then all of your organization's working on the same sprint. It's still one sprint. So everyone's beginning and ending on the same day. So your opportunity to change direction is greatly increased. Less does have, and this is, I think, somewhat unique, or at least if you look through it's historically very unique. Less has an incredibly strong focus on technical excellence. Incredibly strong, and gives lots and lots of guidance as to technically what you should be doing. Because if you want to make the most of Scrum, you have to be technically very adaptable. And your organizational adaptability and your product adaptability is massively constrained by your ability to adapt technically. So less is a very, very, on the face of it, simple framework. There's a number of rules which govern it and a number of principles that guide it. And the principles won't be new to lots of people. Things like lean thinking, systems thinking, empirical process control, continuous improvement. These are all things that people are very, very familiar with. And what less asks you to do is to view those principles as what ought to be. Like, this is how things ought to be, and then work towards it gradually and try and improve to this kind of ideal state. And it is, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say, it's probably one of the leanest kind of agile frameworks out there. And it's also probably one of the most customer centric, which is why I think it isn't, sometimes it gets pushed to one side in favor of more kind of structured bureaucratic methods, because it says, that if you to succeed, you need to get your teams really, really close to the users and working with them frequently. And that's one of the biggest keys to success. So there's loads of information on the website, www.less.works. But in essence, it's a framework governed by principles and then surrounded by a deep kind of mindset of experimentation.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And it's certainly relatively easy to digest as well, which was great for me personally. As a busy person, it was great to be able to do that. I really like the idea of a single product backlog, and I know that creates a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. If we have time, it'd be nice to return to that. But you picked on there one of the main themes of tonight, which is about experimentation in how you do things, not just what you're building, which is the kind of key theme. I don't know if there's anything more you'd like to say on that theme before we find out about what we'll be doing at Conveyor.
I think, just as a segue into it, I think there is any framework that tells you there's a single best way of doing things is not telling the truth. There is never a single best way of doing things. Sure, there's plenty of good ways, but what you have to do, if you're serious about going on like this agile journey, to coin a phrase, and if you're serious about using something like less, then what you have to do is indoctrinate that thinking into the organization. There's a great story from came from Toyota. And when people used to go over and visit the Toyota plant, and then they would go there and then look at what they did, and then go back to, say, America or UK or whatever, and copy it. And then they would go back then, like a year later, and they'd say to the people in Toyota, like, "You're not using that thing anymore. That system that you did, we're not using it." And they'd be like, "Well, why would we still be using it?" And they were like, "Well," the people were like, "Well, we thought this was the best way to do things. We've gone and we've copied it." And they're like, "Why have you copied it?" And the one thing they couldn't get a head around in Toyota is like, why are people copying what we do? Because for them, that isn't what they do. What they do isn't the stuff you see. It's their mindset, and it's how they improve things. It's how they experiment. It's how they push things forward. And that's what you need in less. And so taking a view of saying we want to explore less and understand how it's going to work, let's run loads of experiments. Let's create some hypotheses. Let's get feedback. Let's look to the framework and say, what can we take from the framework to help us, and begin that learning journey. And then you get to a point where you've learned enough and you can kind of take on a bit more of it. But you have to kind of deeply understand what it is you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it. And I would always say that don't adopt less. Like, use less to achieve your goals, but don't focus on adopting it. Just use it in a way that serves you best.
Yeah, I really like that idea that there's no one single way of doing things. I think we all see it, don't we? You follow a framework for the sake of following a framework. There are many frameworks that existed over decades and decades, and you got to find what works for you. And that's a kind of really big thing for us. So with that in mind, Mel, over to you. Really, let's talk a little bit more then about what you've been doing within our claims capability area, in particular in experimentation work there.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, just want to say I was massively excited to be selected to be part of this, the piece of project that I was working on, to be involved in the experiments. It's fantastic, and I absolutely loved being part of it. And from the outset, we really clearly said that we wanted to focus not on what we were delivering. That was really clear. We're delivering a new claims application. We didn't want to touch that. We've got a plan. We know what we're doing. We really wanted to experiment with how we were doing it. And we really faced into our problems that we were experiencing at the time. And we used the systems modelling that we learned as part of the LESS training to try and find and define that cause and effect model, which says, to help us to define what are the triggers that are leading us to this position where the problems that we were experiencing. So just as a bit of background for everybody, we were really facing into three main issues, really, that are probably common to a lot of people that are on this call. One being lack of trust. So we're in a position where our stakeholders had kind of got fed up, if I'm honest, of hearing about what they might get in 6 months' time. And there's quite a long time, to be honest, of no real tangible progress. It was all, this is what you might get. It might look like this. This is a design. And they were getting a little bit bored of it, if I'm honest. Second one being poor collaboration. That was really between product, engineers and delivery. So what we're finding was that engineers, because it's quite a big program, it's kind of 2 years worth of work, engineers were really struggling to understand where their tiny little bit of code fit into this big picture. They couldn't really understand it. So what we found was that we were in a place where we had these massive, great big user stories that were really struggling to break down into individual smaller tasks. And we were carrying those stories over sprint into sprint into sprint, which is not a great place to be. And the third one really being culturally, we're kind of fairly immature, to be honest, in that agile journey. And we were in a place where we'd got into a habit of doing these big releases culturally. So we were waiting kind of 3-4 months before we were able to release anything. And we were kind of in a place where the business kind of understood agile. They'd been on some training courses, but didn't really feel it and couldn't really touch and feel it yet. And Nick's smiling. But it's all a bit theoretical, I think, is kind of the background. So what we did, basically, we built several hypotheses, built on 3 kind of main areas, those being communication, making things more tangible, and improving our quality. Yes, those 3 things are all linked. But what we did was basically drew out about 9 or 10 hypotheses on the assumption, on those 3 themes, on the assumption that would improve in turn trust, collaboration, and culture. So we built up those experiments, actually spending quite a lot of time, if I'm honest, on that rigor around the experiments. I thought I'd been doing experiments before, but what I'd done was just set up the start. I hadn't thought about the end. So that just became kind of a process of continuous improvement. But we put quite a lot of rigor into how we documented these experiments. So defined the time frames. So how long we were going to give this experiment before we needed to do a bit of a plan, do, check, act on it to see whether it was working or not. We devised some metrics. So how would we know what good would look like? And just basically put quite a lot of time into that up front. So we kind of gave ourselves a bit of a goal, essentially. So 2 experiments that I'm going to talk to you about briefly. So one of them was around delivering more iteratively, so on a 2-weekly basis, deliver to the business some software that they could literally get their hands on and start to play with. Our assumption being that if we delivered that more iteratively, then that business engagement would improve and therefore the trust would improve. So basically we reprioritized our work on the CI/CD pipelines. We pushed code into a pre-production environment, gave the business a URL, and guess what? We were right. Business engagement improved. They started to talk to us more about actually they understand it now, they get it, and actually a bit of a hallelujah moment when one of our key stakeholders said, I get agile now, I understand it. And we've already in the past month made 2 quite small amendments that the business have now seen, and now within a sprint have turned them back around, so they can now see how that fast feedback mechanism actually works in reality. And the second hypothesis was really around communication around the goal. So our hypothesis was that if we can speak to the engineers a bit more about what that goal is, then the team performance and the motivation from that team will improve. So what we did there was we started to run some in-depth planning sessions with BAs, with engineers, with product owners, so that they could start to identify a bit better what the tech tasks were to actually deliver what we were trying to achieve. And from a leadership team perspective, we were really, really transparent in our communication with the team. So we shared with them how difficult these sessions from a leadership perspective were, so that they could understand and got a sense of belonging, that they're part of this journey as well. And guess what? Again, we were right. So we went from a position where our kind of average size of user stories was something ridiculous like 13, 15 points into them now an average of 1 to 3. And velocities improved, throughputs improved, and team motivations improved. So it's great to be part of those and actually have those metrics come to some fruition. And really exciting to see the turnaround in the motivation of the teams and our stakeholder relationships as well. It's been fantastic. So we're now going to start sharing those recommendations that we've pulled together, so we can start to share them across digital, start small and grow it from there, basically. So it was a fantastic experience to be involved in it, and we'll just continue. It's just our ethos now in our team.
And Mel, those are great examples because in many ways they're quite simple as well, aren't they? They're quite simple
really.
to do. So it's not like massive upheaval in order to run that kind of an experiment. So and a couple of areas there where may sound quite basic and fairly obvious, but we've been able to see some real advantage and benefits.
Absolutely. It's all just applying those principles, the LESS principles and the agile principles about transparency and regular delivery of value.
I think, can I say, when we engaged, and well, actually, it was when we were doing the LESS Basics course, and we did something called systems modeling, and everyone seemed to really enjoy it. Yeah. And then it kind of grew arms and legs from there. And I've, to come across a group that got so much from it so quickly. And I think that for me, like when you talk about transparency, one thing you all did was make your own mental models and your own biases really transparent. And it kind of sounds like, we put 4 to 6 hours maybe into coming up with a model. But then the fantastic thing was, that was pure systems thinking. You all were happy to have your minds changed. You all kind of come across and said, okay, we think this is what's happening right now, cause and effect. Yeah. And you went away and you ran some experiments and you measured some things and you come back and large parts of the model you could say, well, we thought that and that and that were going to happen, and we were right. And it was so lovely to see you kind of for it to pay off in that way. It was from my perspective, it was a lovely experience to get to work with you all and to get to go through that. And what I also liked was that sometimes the model wasn't right, and that led to more conversation. Mm-hmm. And I just the way that you all approached it was wonderful. And and I really look forward to what we've learned and the way this kind of little model, this way of kind of generating experiments for using systems thinking and using LESS principles. I really hope that at some point we get to do it again and we get to kind of share this with more people, because I think it's it's a wonderful way of going about doing it. So thank you for like bearing with me, right, teaching you some of this kind of things.
Ben, let's just talk a little bit more about systems modeling there, because it has been a tool that we've used quite a lot. And people have got various different understandings of systems thinking. Just explain for us what a system model is, what it does, and I guess the benefits that it brings as well, if we can.
Yeah, of course. So if I just start with systems thinking, right, and if I just summarize systems thinking, which is systems thinking is it's a way of thinking, it's a view that you can create that helps to move away from the human tendency to break things down into small pieces. It's effectively seeing things holistically, trying to see the whole. And the thing is, although we can use systems thinking as a school of thought, we need some of its tools so we can actually see something. Or if we were to touch something, even if it's via Miro, we need something so we can see it. Because what we're doing when we're thinking systemically and using systems thinking and modeling, we're trying to understand cause and effect. We're not trying to say this is the absolute truth of the cause and effect. But we're trying to get people together from different perspectives to come up with an idea of how we think our system is behaving so we can begin to see the whole. And once we can see the whole, we can begin to avoid unintended consequences. So if you have so oftentimes people say, well, I've got an idea, but we're going to do this. And then when you say, okay, so what are the consequences of that? And they say, oh, well, it's great, because they're in their head, they've sold themselves on it. And in systems thinking, what we do is we facilitate it and we have other people challenge that. And we say, well, great, it might send that thing through the roof, but then does it send anything else up, which we don't want to go up, or send something down that we don't want to go down? Are you assuming that it's just going to happen, or is there other stuff that needs to happen in order for it to create that point? So by systems modeling, you can understand your leading and lagging indicators. In systems, when you start thinking systemically, you realize that there really isn't any blame. It's really hard to blame anything because everything's connected. And so, it isn't about predicting what's going to happen in the world and saying, no, this is the truth, this is what's going to happen. But it is about creating a greater understanding based upon different perspectives so that collectively we can get together. And I think this is what, Mel, you and the team did fantastically, is that you were all behind that model because you'd all created it.
Yeah. And I think doing it together as well helped us break down some of those our assumptions around the causes. So, from that group discussion, we kind of had somebody saying we think it's because of this and we think we could work on that. Well, we just expanded it further in the conversation and said, actually, if you go back a little bit further, maybe we should try looking at X instead.
Yeah.
Just kept it really simple, but it really helped us to think through and question each other.
Yeah, and when we do it in conversation, everyone's like, oh, no, it isn't that, it's this. But actually, these are rarely are they ors, they are often ands. Mm-hmm. And when we're just doing it verbally, we're looking for an absolute. But both of those things that people have said are probably true. And there's probably 100 other things as well. Yeah. And through going through this process, we can see that and begin to then say, okay, well, we think this will happen if we do this. Or let's give ourselves a week and let's try it out. And I think it's a wonderful way to go about doing it. If anyone is interested in systems thinking, there's a great book called The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. It's kind of, I'd say it's a seminal text on systems thinking and learning organization. So it's well worth a read if you're that way inclined.
And Ben, I'm just going to relate that back to something you were talking about earlier on as well, when we were talking about anti-patterns in Scaled Agile, and you were saying that one of the things that happens is, particularly in product ownership, that you don't see the whole anymore, you only see the bit that you're doing. And I guess there's this sort of tendency to optimize for your one bit without necessarily understanding what's happening elsewhere. And everyone's busy optimizing for their own area, but not necessarily understanding the consequence it has on everybody else and on all the other parts of the product as well. So yeah. It's a great awareness tool, a great way of being able to show those relationships, both known and unknown, between different elements.
Well, it's great you made that connection, Nick. It does remind me, because if you have kind of if you have individual team product ownership and you don't have oversight, if one team product owner decides to deprioritize something, then that's lost. You've got no visibility of that unless you've got loads of proxies and reports. But if you keep it simple, and if someone comes in with something that absolutely has to be done, then you can control that. You know where it is, and you're not going to get horrible phone calls at like 5:30 on a Friday after evening saying, so we're going to get fined on Monday unless we do this thing. You gain transparency by keeping it simple, but it then gets harder, and it's a trade-off. And systems thinking is a lovely way to view it all.
Brilliant. I think you just increased the book sales on the Fifth Discipline.
Yeah.
Look at the comments. Just a reminder to people who are watching and listening. Keep your questions coming. We're going to move to a Q&A session in a minute, so it'd be good to get your thoughts and views. But Ben, if we can, I'd just like to return as well to one of the other themes that we picked up on. I know it was a hot topic at Conveyor, and it's something I'm sure that comes up a lot in less. So it's the idea of the single product backlog, because I know that can be a challenging concept, particularly in big scaled organizations. Let's just return to that a little bit. And what is that? What does the single product backlog look like, and what are the implications of that?
I feel like I should ask maybe you guys that question. It's difficult. So first and foremost, I think from a less perspective, and this is something which I think is really valuable, is ask yourself the question: what is your product? Because there's a couple of lines. I mean, maybe I think it's still in the new Scrum guide. It was definitely in the old one that really kind of which make this really clear. First of all, right? And I think this is the big challenge. So the Scrum guide always said that the development team create the product increment. Like only the development team create the product increment. And that product increment should be something which could potentially be shipped. So what that implies is that that development team have no dependencies. And they are able to do everything they need to do to deliver the increment on that product. And then it goes into Scrum guidance, and many teams work on the product. So if you have many teams working on a single product and none of those teams don't have dependencies, that's enough of a challenge. But then what you have to consider is if you then see a dependency, from a Scrum perspective, what that implies is that whatever you're dependent upon is part of your product. So in order to keep using Scrum, whatever that dependency is needs to be brought in. So when you start talking about single product backlog and you begin to take that view, what you begin to see is actually we haven't got 25 products, we've got one. And in order to move the one product, we need to change our organizational structure. And the teams will need to change. And then what you end up with is you can have a lovely clear list of what needs to be done, but you have to do a lot of heavy lifting to get there. So this is why from a less huge perspective, we say work towards it incrementally, in an evolutionary way, because it's too much to do in one go. But then the challenge is what to do if everyone had a product owner role. The challenge is, okay, so if it's all about the product, then where does engineering department fit in? And unless there isn't much room for kind of separate departments, because you can't have one or the other. As a product owner, as a product community, as a product team, you need to be able to understand the gambles you're taking. And then actually you need to be really close to the people that are creating the product and to the users. So the big challenges are single product backlog needs often restructuring an organization. It often means that the backlog ceases to be forming of like components and technical tasks and is more feature based. And then that maybe means some work needs to be redesigned. But once you get to that point and you use something less huge, you can end up with a dynamic organizational structure, which is incredibly powerful. But it does kind of flip a lot of the common thinking on its head. And I think this is why it's a challenge as well, is because we're asking people to think very, very differently and move away from some of their comfort zones. And this is why other frameworks allows people to remain in their comfort zone. So a definition of product, what I would say is, if I keep my pure kind of less trainer hat on, is if you've got around 3, 4, 5, 6 teams, you can probably get away with saying, right, this is the product, and you just kind of start using less, and you can do it in one go. If you're getting above like 7, 8 teams, and you're going to be looking at less huge. And so what we recommend is understand what your ideal product could be, then define an initial product. And then gradually over time, increase the breadth of that product definition. So you're right, it can be fluid in that respect, but it's an improvement path. When I was at Deutsche Bank, I think there was talk of 20 odd products, and I think we came down to 3, knowing that there's probably going to be 1 after you've been through this process. So yeah, it does then reduce the number of products that you perceive that you have, and it's a worthwhile thing if your goals align with the goals of less, which is for always finding the highest value piece of work and then having as many teams as you can do work on that highest value piece of work. And if that's what you want to achieve and that's your goal, less is a fantastic kind of guide for that. It isn't easy, it does take time and it is challenging, but the payoff is huge. It takes a while to get there.
Yeah, and I know this was certainly a topic that exercised us, quite a lot. I remember, Ben, we did a number of workshops, didn't we, where we were trying to identify how many products we really got. I think we got down to 3 in the end.
Yeah,
Before
yeah.
we're there or thereabouts. I think there's a little bit more work to do, but heading in the right direction. Yeah.
But, I mean, yeah, Peter Senge, the systems thinking guy, said, it can take a few years for a high leverage approach to pay off. And if I look at less adoptions I've been involved in, some of them, one of them's going for 3 years now. And when I talk to them, I say, yeah, no, absolutely, it's paying off. We are flying now. But it's taken a few years for them to actually kind of really stick with it and figure out how to make it pay off and change their own behaviours.
Fantastic. Okay, at that point, I'm going to ask if there are any questions, and if there aren't any questions, I'm going to ask some more of my own and take over a little bit. I'm just going to pause just for a sec. Okay, so I'm going to come back. So Ben, Mel, we've got about 15 minutes left. What have we not talked about already? What's worth covering that I've collected so far?
Well, Nick, I'll ask a question of you.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what would you say is probably the other than single product backlog? What would you say is one of the most challenging facets of less?
Of less, what's the most challenging facet? I really like the experimentation approach. I think that getting your head around that and making it so that it's everybody who's able to experiment and think about differently, and I guess sort of challenging, using different views, looking at how other businesses do it. I think that's a huge thing for me, and I guess you could do that in any model, not just in less. And there's a really interesting topic on the back of that for me as well. And I know Abby is on this call, and she hears me banging on about this all the time. But this thing about organizational memory, how do you learn from those experiments? How do you, when you've done it, how do you make sure that you don't end up repeating that experiment in another 12 months' time in a different team who hasn't got the awareness or hasn't learned that lesson? I see that so often, that you fall down the same traps, or you just end up in this vicious cycle. Right? It's quite common, going round and round and round. Failed fixes, Abby says. Yeah, and there's that organizational memory, that thing that allows you to evolve and not fall down those previous traps. I think that's a fascinating topic. But within less, I think there are lots of things. The things. I mean, single product backlog was the biggest for me, by quite a long way. That was quite huge. I think. Some of the ways in which you bring together communication, and the fact that you don't need lots of these coordination and proxy roles. So making sure that the teams are as close as they possibly can be to the customer. A lot of businesses struggle with that, and some have quite a transactional relationship between business and delivery teams. That was big as well. Getting rid of all that, and again, in kind of traditional scaled agile models, particularly kind of Scrum's idea. I see organizations where you have lots of scrums, and that not great. I think those are kind of the key things for me. I like one of the analogies you gave very early on, Ben, where you talked about how many scrums there are, and actually less is almost kind of one big scrum rather than lots of little scrums.
Yeah, that's the idea. But I mean, what less isn't is lots of scrum teams, which is a mistake people make. People look at Scrum team, product owner, Scrum master, and development team or developer roles as it is now, and they copy and paste that in the organization. And less isn't that at all. In less, there is no concept of Scrum team. It's a product development group. And so we have this idea is, we still have one product owner, and we have bare minimum Scrum masters to serve the teams, and it's mostly just teams doing the work, and we don't do this kind of copy and paste error, because that. Anyone that's been on my training will know kind of the pitfalls and the dangers of doing that.
Absolutely. Ben, you've posted a nice thing in here as well, I think.
Yeah, it's the systemsthinker.com is a lovely website. And when Abby said failed fixes, I guessed what she was talking about, something that we've been talking about, me and her last week, about fixes that fail, which is what's known as a systems thinking archetype, which is always when it's basically just means addressing the symptom and not the actual problem. And so it just comes back and bites you in the arse again. And then I think, excuse my language, but this is the idea. This is what systems thinking is great for, because systems thinking knows that these patterns exist, and it gives you mechanisms by which to deal with them. And I think that's incredibly powerful, and not known enough.
Absolutely. So Mel, just going back to your experiences here as well, and you've sort of lived and breathed this approach for the last 8 months or so.
Yeah.
I've learned quite a lot in a short period of time. For anybody who's just starting out on this journey and is wanting to think about experimenting themselves, what are the kind of key call outs you would give? What advice can you give people?
Okay, a couple of things there. I think keep it simple. So I think, we kind of came into this experiment thing thinking we could just change the world immediately. And I think actually when we did the systems modeling work and actually talked it through, just keep to those simple principles rather than trying to do everything in one go. I think so. Just those principles around transparency and communication, they were just simple tweaks that we made, but they made a massive difference. And I think from an experimentation point of view, I think that rigor around the experiments that we put together, it was fantastic and really helped us. Like I said, I think I've done experimentation before, but I've just defined what's not working and what we want to change. I've never documented how do we know what good looks like and what are those metrics, and give it a week, give it 4 weeks, identify that up front. Sometimes you just end up putting in change. It's just part of a continuous improvement cycle, but I think you can never, it's difficult to then tie it back to an experiment. It's just change, it's just what you do. So I think putting that rigor in is a fantastic learning for us, because then you can play it back and say we did this and this is the result very, very, very clearly.
Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions come in that look to be based more around ceremonies. So one is around the coordination between teams and sprint planning. And separately, Ben, there's a question about which ceremonies are team-based in less.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer these from a pure less perspective, and then if you want to add anything.
Mel's perspective on the first question in sprint planning will be a really interesting one to come back to as well. Let's get the less view first.
All right. So the less view is, and I'll try and can answer them both from one. So all of the ceremonies, all of the events in less involve the team. There isn't anything that's there which doesn't involve a team, because the team are the people in the team, the teams themselves are the most important thing in an organization. So all of the events contain representatives of all teams together. Now, one of the things that LESS promotes heavily is multi-team ceremonies, multi-team events. So if you know that you're going to have to coordinate with another team, let's say, then you probably would have done product backlog refinement with them. So you would know what's coming up and you know how the work is going to look like. When it comes to sprint planning too, you're going to be doing it at the same time. Maybe you do it in separate breakout rooms and use like a diverge merge in Teams or Zoom. So you're doing it independently when you're coming back together, or you mix the teams up. And the way that you resolve a lot of the coordination effort is by using communication, but also embracing technical excellence. But a lot of all of the events in LESS are optimized for the teams working together, cross team as well as within the team. The only event ceremony in LESS which includes a much wider group is the only event that LESS adds, and that's the overall retrospective, which is where you would have product owners, scrum masters, managers, and team representatives coming together to take a systemic view of your product group, with a view to saying how do we accelerate our progress towards our goal? What new things can we try? But yeah, I mean, if you look at the LESS website, you'll see that actually the only people that are mandatory in the vast majority of the events are actually the team members. No one else is mandatory in a lot of this.
Fantastic, and that's the LESS official view. Mel, have you got anything to add to that from what you said?
Yeah, what I took from LESS really is literally doing more with less. So we were fairly pragmatic in our approach, and we added in where we needed it, added in a planning session that we needed to help those engineers to get up to speed. So we just put those sessions in, do it once, do it right, get that communication out once. And then that really helped the engineers when they went into sprint planning. They actually understood what we were talking about rather than just getting a bit lost. So we literally took the approach of less is more. Let's get the right people in a room at the right time to do whatever we need to do it once and do it right.
And that's important, because I mean, one thing you didn't do is say like, well, we've got all this stuff, let's keep all this stuff and let's do Scrum as well.
Yeah.
And this is, we talk about anti-patterns, is when people do that. What you should be doing is saying, well, let's put what we've got to one side and let's look at Scrum and say, what's the bare minimum we need to add to this right now?
Yep.
And you add it. And then you add stuff so carefully, because the more you add, the slower you become.
Exactly, and that's the good thing about the experiments, is that you can give yourself 2 sprints, a month to actually ascertain whether this is working or not, and then stop, plan, do, check, act, go back to it, do something different.
Okay, Mel, have you got any thoughts about where you're experimenting next? What are you going to go on to next?
Good question. I think we're going to look at improving the communication, so around reporting. So some hypotheses there around giving more or less metrics at the given stage is something we're going to look at next, and definitely going to start on sharing these learnings. We're really keen to help other people that might have been through something similar, to share that and share the love around the experiments and what we've done, because that's what it's all about, learning.
Absolutely brilliant. Just give us an idea about there on how many hypotheses you've been working with, because we haven't really covered that, have we here?
No, we documented 9 at the beginning, and I think we've now extended that to about 11. So we're just going to keep doing this. As and when we learn more things out of the experiments, we'll just keep adding new hypotheses to it, and we keep going back to the systems model and adding things. So challenging our thinking and our assumptions, which might be about, we assume that we give more data to our stakeholders and they'll get more out of it. They won't necessarily. So let's challenge some of that thinking. So we'll just keep going.
Brilliant. Brilliant. We've got a hand up. I can't actually see who it is, but if you put your hand up, feel free to ask a question. Brilliant.
Hi Nick, hi Ben, hi Maverick, Saj. Hi guys, you're doing a fantastic job. Great discussion, great talk. So really enjoyed it. I'm going to ask a question. It might sound a bit controversial. Can't be as controversial as what Donald Trump comes out with. So I'll give you a shot. Ben, I know you've talked about less and how Kaveh has been using the less framework. But a question to you, Nick. Did you consider the other 3 scaling frameworks before you decided to kind of go with less? Did you consider Scrum at Scale, Safe, Nexus?
Yeah, okay. So that's a great question. Where have we got to? I guess we had some familiarity with some of those frameworks within the business already. Why did we land on less, though? I mean, I think it's not just because Ben did a great job of as a sort of salesperson, but we were already doing some work with Ben already. We were doing some coaching work with some of our people, and I guess it resonated with us and our culture as a business as well. Ben talks about the simplicity of it. It's fairly easy to get your head around and to be able to understand it, but it's also really about getting closer to the customer ultimately and getting that connection. And so I think that's ultimately one of the reasons why we went down that model. We have toyed around with parts of other frameworks in the past, and I guess there are pros and cons to them all, right? That's why we ended up with less.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right in what you said there. There are pros and cons, and I think it's in terms of the end of the day, it's what you're delivering to your customers, the value you're going to deliver to your customers, and the framework that's going to sort of fit around it. I always say, look at the work and then decide the framework, not the other way around. And a lot of people, a lot of organizations make that mistake. Oh, we're going to go Scrum, or we're going to go Kanban, or we're going to go Safe, but not really understanding the crux of what they're trying to deliver, and that's the kind of pitfall they fall into. But yeah, thank you very much for your response. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I guess I was about to say what Abby's just put in the chat, which is for us, it wasn't about ever saying we're going to take all of this, we're suddenly going to move to a new framework and we're going to stick to the letter of the law on that. It was more about let's take something we're less familiar with and use it as a way of just challenging our thinking. There's an opportunity to do something a bit different, which was the principles really. I'll be really clear and say now we are not following less to the letter. Nor are we following any other framework. We have a hybrid approach. I think in the early days we were probably guilty of doing what Ben said earlier, which was, that's a great model. It works for Spotify. It seems to make sense. Let's scale that. We haven't got a Spotify model. We've got our own model. Is it perfect? No way. There's loads of work for us to do, but I think that the whole approach here is about let's continually improve that model. As we go and learn from our experiences, which is what this talk's all been about tonight.
Well, you know what Henrik Neuberg said about the Spotify model, don't you? He works for Spotify, nice Swedish company, but he won't work for any other organization.
Absolutely.
So don't use it.
So it's the same as the Toyota point Ben was making earlier, I think. Yeah.
One thing I will say, right, is that what Les does a good job at is if you've got intelligent people in your organisation, if you've got untapped potential, Les will unleash it. And I think a lot of the other frameworks fail to do that. And I think that's one of the major problems. Is that if you look to, and I'm not going to bash safe at all, but need to say that that if you go and you train everyone up in safe and you get loads of SPCs and you try and make your organisation in that way, you hinder thinking. You don't indoctrinate thinking, and that's the major problem with any organisational change. You need people to think and change their behaviours. And the nice thing about less is that you can start from you can pick the bits that you feel are going to benefit. You experiment with them, and you add stuff if you need to. A lot of it, particularly safe, you take that, you're looking at it, say, what can I take away? And they'll say, well, we better keep that just in case because of this, or keep that. But this is just it. This respects your intelligence, asks you to learn more, and then kind of sets you on this path. And I think that's why people at Kaveh got into it, because you're bright people who want to manifest your own destiny and don't really want to be told what to do.
Absolutely.
Can I ask a follow-up question, if that's okay?
That's one. I'm conscious of time. There's another question, but yeah, go for it. Go on.
So in your organisation, do you primarily have Scrum teams, or do you have sort of Kanban teams as well? And if you do have Kanban teams, how does that work with less, and how's that compatible with less?
Mel, do you want to cover that from a perspective?
So
we have a mix of both, don't we, really?
Yeah, we do largely have a lot of Scrum teams, but there are some of Kanban that are working more in the kind of BAU legacy world. Do you want to cover how that works in less, Ben?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they work together quite well. I mean, less has been used without even really using Scrum, if that makes any sense. And there's a load of case studies written up about how people have tried different things. Ultimately, if you look at something like Kanban, it's just a manifestation of lean in many respects, right? It's a part of it. And and queuing theory is a principle within less. So if people are using, Kanban and they're using queuing theory correctly, if people are being empiric, then you can make it work fine. I mean, the major difference being is that, you're not going to, maybe they won't be an enforced point at which they do a retrospective, or there won't be an enforced point at which they do planning. But at some point, they're going to be reflecting and improving, and at some point, they're going to be planning. You can absolutely make it work. It fits in really well, as long as people are sensible and adult about it and don't get too dogmatic about things, right? I mean, all of these frameworks are based upon empirical process control. They're all based upon adapting and learning. And what that means is that if you've got two groups, and one group is, say, Kanban and one group is Scrum, then you need both of them to come and meet in the middle. And you can make it work. But when either side is too rigid, the other side is going to get annoyed because they're not changing, and it's not going to work. So it just takes a bit of being grown up about it. I'm going to be honest.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. I'm going to come back to, and I'm conscious we're running out of time, or we have run out of time. I'm going to come back to that question from Thomas in a minute and get your both perspectives on that. Just before I do, just a massive thank you. I appreciate we're out of time. There may be people who need to drop off. If you are interested in any roles and opportunities at Kaveh, we will have our recruitment team who are going to stay on the line after this. So if you are thinking about dropping off but you're interested, might be worthwhile just hanging on for a couple more minutes. So let's just go back to the last question we've got on the board here, which is about structuring work between the CEO and the teams. And I guess this is about, Ben, a challenge that every organisation has is, how do you go from sort of boardroom to backlog? How do you go from your strategy and break that down and organise it amongst your teams? And I guess, coming back to my favourite topic, the sort of single product backlog is going to play a role in this here.
Yeah, I mean, if you can nail the single product backlog, your life is simple. I mean, if I talk about less than a small organisation, like 3 or 4 teams, the structure is there's a CEO, he has a leadership team. On that, one of the people on the leadership team is head of engineering. He's also Scrum Master, and that was a choice that he made when he learned about less. He said, "Well, I can be the head of engineering, but I think I'm more effective as a Scrum Master." So that's how it works. So the leadership team in this organisation is Scrum Master, Product Owner, COO, and a salesperson, and that's the leadership team. right? And that's great, and it works for them. But that's a different kind of situation. And I think that's probably the leanest that I've seen it, right? And then that's a relatively flat structure. Then when you kind of move away from that, what you want to do is you might end up with a level of management in between, perhaps, if there's a certain size. But you don't want it to go any further than that, really. Because the more it goes in, the more pain you're going to create for yourself. Well, the further you're going to get away from the truth, and the harder it's going to get to have real change. So, I mean, what Les will say is it's really, really flat. You're going to have a CEO, and you're going to have your product development group. And then within that product development group, you've got product, and you've got all the developers and the engineering side of things, and that's all one, reasonably amorphous blob. We don't get people who say we're part of engineering or we're part of product. We say we are working on this product. Now, if you take it, and one of the most popular, one of the biggest case studies for Les, I think there's a few thousand people at Nokia Ericsson making mobile phone masts. Their product team consisted, I think, of like 100 or so people. Because it had sales, it had marketing, it had everything in there. But that was the organization. I mean, and that's the kind of beauty of it. So Tom, to answer your question, you want to get like, unless it's very, very minimal structure. In reality, what happens is that people deal with some kind of legacy, and it's a case of how can you make that as lean as shallow and as narrow as possible.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. We're gonna leave it there. As always, we've completely run out of time. I think we could go for a while longer yet, but that was really good. Thanks both Ben and Mel for taking time out and sharing experiences, and Ben, your knowledge of Les in particular, much appreciated. Thanks to everybody who is either logged onto this or is going to watch this back later. Have a good evening. Please sign up to follow us on social media. You'll find out, as I said before, about all the events we've got coming up throughout the rest of the year, and also you'll be the first to hear about new roles and opportunities. And to that end, we've got one of our recruitment team on the line if anybody's interested and wants to chat. Becky, welcome. So thank you to everybody who is dropping off, and much appreciated, and we hope to see you back very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Cheers, Nick. Thank you, Mel.